Continue. Hello, everybody. I'm Reverend Richard Nordgren, Associate Member of St. John's Lutheran Church in beautiful Greenpoint, Brooklyn. Church is sponsoring a series of Bible studies called The Many Faces of God. For the last 3 months, we have gone through the Old Testament, beginning in Genesis, looking at the many different ways that God has been portrayed or depicted, or has different roles that he fulfills. We will continue that search for the many faces of God as this week when we begin our exploration of the prophetic works of the Old Testament. As you probably know, this Bible study group is also being stored and used, can be used on Facebook, Instagram, and what's the third one, Hannah?
Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube.
The church's website.
Yes, and the church website. Okay. All right. So with that sort of introduction, let's begin by talking about the events which led up to the inauguration of the prophetic institution. If you've ever had the occasion to look at a map of the Middle East and have that map also present rainfall, you will see that there is a stretch from the upper basin of the Tigris and Euphrates River down through Lebanon, parts of Syria, through parts of Israel, and into Egypt. Historically, this section of land, which is not a political division, it is a climatic division, is known as the Fertile Crescent because of the conditions of rainfall, soil characteristics. It is the type of place where you can grow surplus of crops, which are necessary for the formation of even larger and larger political units. In that sweep, the Fertile Crescent sweep, Israel does not lie in a particularly favorable place. The northern part of Israel gets adequate amount of rainfall, 20, 25 inches a year, and that's quite sufficient for dryland farming. But as you get further south and also up into the hill countries, it gets drier and drier. And you go down to the Red Sea coast, like at Eilat, you're lucky on an average year to have 2-3 inches of rain. This part of the geography of the Fertile Crescent did not make Israel a particularly attractive place, for stronger, bigger, and more aggressive nations to put in their gun sites. There just was not enough low-hanging fruit to make much of a difference. Nor was Israel blessed with abundant, usable, and needed raw materials like copper, iron, tin, and the like. Those metals, came from other places and were worked into usable objects by local craftsmen. But the one big disadvantage that Israel faced, and it faced it time and time again, was that it was on the most practical route between the region along the Tigris-Euphrates River called Mesopotamia, and the other regional power of the era, which was Egypt. So if you were an aggressive Assyrian ruler and wanted to take on Egypt, you had to go through Israel. It was, for on many occasions, a situation where Israel had nominal independence, but was really a vassal state to one of the larger powers. Or if it wasn't a vassal state, it was sort of set up as a buffer between the two contending powers of the region, Egypt and Mesopotamia. for much of the period of time that we've studied in the last 3 months, those more powerful regions, neighboring Israel, were preoccupied with other things. In Egypt, they had some crop failures. They had wars of dynastic succession. They had wars with nations to the west and south of them. They had been invaded by the sea people. And on the other end of the Fertile Crescent, the tribes there, were having a difficult time forming into powerful regional forces. Well, that all began to change in the time when Ahab was king over the northern kingdom, and the Assyrians, had a very aggressive foreign policy, and their policy was to ask for no quarter or given one if begged to do so. They had a policy of conquering and then removing the vast majority of people who lived in that conquered terrain and sending them off to a labor pool in some other part of their empire. And then resettling the newly vacated land with other tribes that they had done the same thing to, but had done it in different parts of their places they controlled. So for the first time, Israel is not just faced with peer-to-peer conflict. It was faced with conflict by vastly superior forces, both in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. The kings of Israel and Judah, the United Nation that David had put together and which his son Solomon inherited, fell apart after Solomon's death. Excuse me for a minute. The northern tribes, northern 10 tribes, and the southern 2 tribes, did not get along with each other all that well, but they were never at any, I'll cut your throat type of conflict. They tended to, have a policy of live and let live. Now, of course, that didn't help them stand up against the more powerful neighbors who were intruding in their kingdom. But the vast majority of the rulers of both Judah and of Israel tended toward short-term, goals, looking after self-interest or interest of their powerful allies, and did not seek out a foreign policy which would encourage the formation of a coalition or an allied group, which might be able to have greater leverage when their more powerful neighbors went on a military campaign. So the rulers of Israel and Judah proved to be real disappointments as leaders of the people, but they were also disappointments for other reasons. Now, God had not been particularly excited or enthusiastic about initiating the institution of a monarchy. It was something he very reluctantly asserted to. And he had, God had hopes that the kings over his people would act as his governor or viceroy, would be faithful servants, carrying out the delegated responsibilities that God had entrusted to them. Well, kings will be kings and rulers will be rulers, and hardly any of them saw themselves as the viceroys or governors that God had appointed to proclaim and protect the divine message. Further alienating these rulers from God was the habit of permitting and even stronger than that, embracing the worship of foreign gods. Now, most of the conflict between God and Israel had to do with, up to this point, had to do with um, the degree of faithfulness or loyalty to God. Many times, the rulers and or their subjects, fancied themselves getting a better deal from the deities of their neighbors, and that may or may not have been of practical benefit to them, but it did have the consequences that God withdrew support and protection that had been offered in the covenant, first to Abraham and then later at Sinai. With Assyria on the march, Egypt as a potential major rival, God did not see much benefit or practical value of trying to get kings to do the work of God. Instead, we find God turning to individuals who had the strength of character, the integrity, and the independence to represent God in the courts of power, before the royalty, before the priestly caste, and before the people who had enough money or other resources to make a difference. There had been prophets in Israel before the time we're about to touch on. Nathan, Samuel, were well-known prophets who behaved admirably. But there were many others, court prophets, who saw themselves beholden to their paymaster and tended to give sweet and comforting messages rather than speaking the truth to them. So we'll begin tonight, a series of scans of the first the work of Isaiah and then some other prophets. Isaiah is a long book, was it 66 chapters, I believe, and scholarly consensus is that it was written by three different authors at three different periods, historical periods, and dealing with three different sets of circumstances. There has been, some talk about maybe just two authors, but I'm not convinced of that hypothesis. The idea of having three different authors for the book that we know as Isaiah, still I think has a lot of strength to it, and it helps us understand the nature of the messages and what the prophets were trying to accomplish. So let's have a little introduction to the calling of this first prophet. And I'd ask for a reader to go to Isaiah 6 and read the first 13 verses. Tess, would you do that?
Sure.
Thank you.
So Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 13, yeah?
Yes.
A vision of God in the temple. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. Seraphs were in attendance above him. Each had 6 wings. With 2 they cover their faces, and with 2 they cover their feet, and with 2 they flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The pivots on the thresholds shook at the voices of those who called, and the house filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. Yet my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding a live coal that had been taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. The seraph touched my mouth with it and said, Now that this has touched your lips, your guilt has departed and your sin is blotted out. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. And he said, "Go and say to this people, keep listening, but do not comprehend. Keep looking, but do not understand. Make the mind of this people dull, and stop their ears and shut their eyes, so that they may not look with their eyes, and listen with their ears, and comprehend with their minds, and turn and be healed." Then I said, "How long, O Lord?" And he said, "Until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is utterly desolate, until the Lord sends everyone far away, and vast is the emptiness in the midst of the land. Even if a tenth part remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump."
You have to unmute. There you go.
Okay. Yeah. Well, what did you hear in this call passage that Isaiah, is called as a prophet? What are some of the things that stand out to you in this passage?
That's an interesting way to be made clean, touching
Yeah.
live coal. It's like, yeah, maybe I don't want to be called. I mean,
Yeah.
this is one of my favorite call stories in all of scripture because of the weirdness of it. It is just friggin' intense.
Mm-hmm.
You got creatures flying above and coal and burning stuff, and then a nonsensical mandate.
Yeah. You don't get the grandeur and glory like you find here probably until you get to Daniel. Yeah. Megan, what did you hear? Yeah, that caught your attention in this passage.
I don't know. When I was reading this, I just it just seems like God's like really mad. Like just really, really mad. Like the whole time I was reading this, I was like, God's mad. Like, I'm just like, I don't know. And he's basically just wanting everybody to basically go away. It seems like.
Okay. Pretty fed up with everybody. Yeah.
I think he has a good reason to be. Nobody has been doing really the right thing, so I can see why he'd be mad.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's certainly in there. One of the other things that I think is particularly noteworthy is the emphasis on the holiness of God. It's been part and parcel of the beliefs of the Jewish people that the temple was the house of God. That was where God was going to be found if he's going to be found any place. And if God is happy with you, you would be in residence. If God was not happy with you, you would not be in residence. It's just as simple as that. It has the effect of concretizing God too. When you say, well, this is the house that we've created for you. When you're in residence, we know things are pretty good. But I think it has the risk attached to it that in making God particular to a certain location, where good and positive and wonderful things happen, and thinking, well, what happens if you don't have the ability to get into Jerusalem and wander up to the temple and find the smoke and the voice and all that stuff. It is I think it's a failure of the universalization tendency that we find in some parts of the Old Testament. And that leads me to suspect that this call story was reworked by the priestly caste during the exile. This early section of Isaiah has a lot of different ways that God is going to or will be working in the life of Israel. Okay? And Megan, would you turn to the first chapter of Isaiah and read verses 4 through 6 and then 10 and 11?
You said 4 through 6 and then 10 through 11, or 1 through
Yes.
6?
Chapter 1, verses 4 through 6, and then 10 and 11.
Okay. Ah, sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, offspring who do evil, children who deal corruptly, who have forsaken the Lord, who have despised the Holy One of Israel, who are utterly estranged. Who do you seek further beatings? Oh no, why do you seek further beatings? Why do you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart is faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and bleeding wounds. They have not been drained or bound up or softened with oil.
Mhm.
Hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the teachings of our God, you people of Gomorrah. What to me is the multitude of your sacrifices, says the Lord. I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats.
Okay. So God's not going to take any bull from your house if you're not repentant, yeah? Okay, Pastor, would you read Isaiah in the 2nd chapter, the first 5 verses?
The word that Isaiah, son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore.
Okay. Man, I don't know how many times that passage has been, repeated and held up as the message when people are really concerned about the level of violence that they're exposed to. Okay, there's one other section that I'll read that, and that's in the 4th chapter, beginning with the 2nd verse. On that day, branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land shall be the pride and glory of the survivors of Israel. Whoever is left in Zion and remains in Jerusalem will be called holy. Everyone who has been recorded for life in Jerusalem, once the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and cleansed the bloodstains of Jerusalem from its midst by a spirit of judgment and by a spirit of burning, then the Lord will create over the whole of Mount Zion and over its places of assembly a cloud by day and smoke and light and shining of a flaming fire by night. Indeed, over all the glory there will be a canopy. It will serve as a pavilion, a shade by day from the heat, and a refuge and a shelter from the storm and rain. So in these 3 passages, if you couple that with Isaiah 6, we find that God is coming across as a majestic, almost unknowable and undefinable power, who is sick and tired of the unfaithfulness of his people. And as we're beginning to see, becoming more and more concerned by a pattern of unrighteous and unjust behavior. Some of the prophets that were active before Isaiah had focused on the social injustice crimes, sins that they were witness to. But up to this point, the prophetic, cast, if you will, had focused mainly on the sin of unfaithfulness and disloyalty when Israel pursued other deities. But as we shall see, the balance begins to shift with increasing emphasis being played on righteousness and justice and fairness and equity for all people. Certainly a message which stirs my beings. It really does. And some people have said, well, you look at these early chapters of Isaiah, and God is saying, I'm going to smite you with a mighty smote. There will be just a remnant left. But didn't God say he was going to create Israel as a mighty nation? That they would be so numerous that you couldn't count them. There seems to be a contradiction there. And while it doesn't appear that God, as the instructor of nations, using Israel as the teaching aid, has sworn a exclusive relationship with Israel, it presents the possibility that there will be others who will vie for God's tenderness and affection. The prophets themselves were not necessarily real eager to get into the work that God had called them to. Perhaps the post-exilic prophets were a little more enthusiastic, but before the exile, they were not real keen on the duty that God had. Elijah was at wit's end trying to figure out how he was going to carry out God's will. Jonah said, it ain't going to work. It's not going to help. Nothing's going to change. I'm going in the other direction. I don't want to go to Nineveh. Tarshish thinks that I think that's a better place. And of course, we were at an advantage because we know how it turned out. The prophets, they came, they delivered their message. They may have delivered it many times. But by and large, they did not, live long enough to see their warnings carried to their natural conclusion. We have that benefit, and we can see, that the warnings that the prophets, such as Isaiah, uttered to the ruling class of Judah, was something that they should have taken very, very seriously. The tone of many of these prophecies, as Megan pointed out, is highly suggestive that there were long periods of time when God was thoroughly disgusted with his people, and the warnings that were put out to change their ways, when went unheeded, did not do much to improve God's sense of well-being. The message that there will be consequences, horrible consequences, death and destruction consequences, is I think for a lot of people a message that creates discomfort. I think the prophets were intent upon that, and if they continue to do that today, centuries after they lived and spoke, the word of the Lord is still a living word.
So I think, Richard, there's this young woman, Greta Thunberg.
Yeah.
I think I actually think our comedians are our prophets today. I really do. Wanda Sykes, Chris Rock, Sacha Baron Cohen. I really think they are very prophetic voices. But this young woman, has been trying to get the world's attention. And rather than people recognizing her prophetic work and the value of it, you know, we had a president that got into Twitter battles with her and took his head and imposed it on her body on Time magazine, you know, and put it up, you know, and it's just like we have an amazing ability to be stuck on stupid.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, you know, I keep, you know, the more I read scripture, and the further I delve into it over the years, I'm just like, we could have changed.
Yeah.
We have made changes, technology, medicine, weaponry, the internet, whatever, but we are still very much the same as human beings in so many ways. You know, we still want to have caste systems that say this is up and these people are down, and we still have that, you know.
Yeah.
It's so, you know, yes, the pre-exilic prophets didn't want to die and probably knew they were being sent on a fool's errand. You know, I mean, Jonah makes more sense to me than anybody else.
Yeah.
And
He
Peter.
was the Henry Kissinger of his age.
Yes. Yes. I mean, the Book of Jonah is by far the top 3 in the Bible.
Yeah.
But I just think, you know, if you think about these guys and you think about somebody like Greta Thunberg, it's the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I'm done.
I hope she takes comfort in knowing that, you know, that she has predecessors who understand fully her frustration. Yeah. So the prophets like Isaiah, you know, did not see, you know, the fulfillment of what they announced is going to be the likely consequences of the policies that were being pursued. I think there is a number of reasons, you know, why we tend to dismiss these warnings. One is that, you know, they take us out of our comfort zone and call us to operate and consider things in very different ways that we've not been used to. Change requires us to learn new skills and new processes and new procedures. It threatens us by, you know, saying, well, maybe my status will be worse off, you know, if we do make the necessary accommodations. Maybe I will lose money if we pull back from seacoast development. You know, maybe, you know, folks that you know, have huge amounts of wealth that I look up to, you know, will have to divest themselves of significant parts of that. And, you know, there's all sorts of reasons why, you know, people tend to reject, you know, warnings. You know, we see it, you know, in our day just as Isaiah saw it in his. You know, he didn't have to talk about climate change. Our prophets have to talk about climate change. You know, you know, he was called to give a message about the necessity of being loyal to God and of being just and fair in your dealings with other people. They also had, you know, a message which you would think, you know, might have been the deal maker. That if they don't change, the consequences are going to be unbearable. You know, you cut down a tree, you know, and maybe you can get growth off the stump. You know, if God's going to come along and, you know, take that new growth and whip it off, perhaps all that you will have left is a remnant. And people would, I would say that, you know, Israelites and Judeans, you know, at that time would probably say, but God, you know, assured us, you know, we have the assurance through Abraham and Moses that we are a favored nation. You know, we are not a nation that's destined for insignificance. And the belief that you know, the prophets were giving false message. I think was very widespread. But Isaiah was not the only one, as we shall see, who talked about the reordering of the covenant relationship. That certainly is the case of some of the other big prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, who also tended to be the messengers of doom and gloom. And going to smite you a good smote, because you have been misbehaving. Okay. But there is this message of comfort, which we've seen. It's a message that in the future, after the wreckage of Israel's consequences has been cleaned up, there will be a new mission for God's people. They will be the instructors of the divine universe. They will occupy tenured chairs of teaching. And people will come and learn righteousness and how to live peacefully with one another. And they will do that in an environment where strife, war, competition, and hatred have no purchase. A place where the instruments of destruction will be turned into the instruments of harvest. So that's sometime often in the future, and it certainly has a utopian cast to it. When we talk about such a radical transformation of human nature, but that's part and parcel of what God instructed the prophets to say. Things are not going to be done by half measures. So the creativity of God, something that we've seen in play, since the very beginning, is certainly at play in these new self-revelations of God. Confusing and contradictory as the messages may be, they always end, with a word of hope. And as we'll see in the second volume of Isaiah, and certainly in the third, that God is anticipating a brand new way of expressing the relationship with Israel and Israel's new mission in that new relationship. There will be a restoration and a renewal, but not necessarily along the lines that people had, we were accustomed to thinking of. It will be a different way of being God's people in the world. So as we go into the prophets, we will see that they have a proclivity to mix politics and poetry, passion and preaching. They probably got dismissed as meddlers and tinkerers in political systems. When a pastor starts making inquiries about what's written in the parishioner's check register, that's not good faithfulness, that's meddling. When pastors talk about how you should use your resources, what are the priorities, often get accused of meddling. But prophets were good at that. And as we shall see, the prophets had multiple messages, for different times, and for different people. We also shall see, that God is just not, concerned with Israel. Israel's neighbors and regional powers will become instruments that God uses, to check the misbehavior of Israel and send it on a right and proper course. These instruments that God has intended to use for correctional purposes ought not to smirk and feel self-righteous and arrogant, because there's many warnings in First Isaiah about the fate of nations that have taken on the unrewarding task of being a rod of iron to punish Israel. So we see now that, very clearly that God's area of concern, is no longer just with this one people, who had at one time largely lived in a isolated cocoon, whose neighbors had very little effect or influence on what went on within the clan or the tribes. But all that, was different in Canaan. And it was different as the regional powers grew and became more powerful. God's scope of concern would extend to the neighboring countries, to the regional powers, and as time went on, to the mega powers such as Rome and Persia. I think if we look at the prophets carefully and balance the promise of consequences with the promise of restoration and new beginning, we can anticipate how a reset is going to work, what it will look like, and how it's going to happen. We'll be looking at that next week and the week after that. So for that, with that, I think I will close down what I need to say and ask, if there's thoughts or reflections or questions that you might have. All right. Okay. Well, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it, and they can watch it later on at their time of leisure. And I would like to close us with a prayer. Okay. Gracious and loving God, if we read scripture, we may find it hard to see your loving concern for us in the messages of warning and of danger. Lord, may your Spirit work upon us to open our minds and to see the reality that we are creating for ourselves and for others. The reality that it may not always have your interests, your purposes, your values, and your ways of doing things uppermost of consideration. Lord, may your Spirit on this Pentecost Sunday, reside and abide with us, constantly illuminating our thoughts about the scriptures, about the world that we live in, to see things through the eyes and perspective that you afford us, not through the eyes of our livelihood, our politics, our culture and customs. Maybe by the work of your Spirit, grow even more able to see things through your perspective. Lord, for those people who are in need tonight, we ask your comfort and your blessing upon them. For those who are struggling with health, with mental issues, with financial issues, with relational problems, comfort and guide them into a stronger place where they can carry out the things that they need to do. So Lord, bless us this night with a good night's rest. Keep us safe in your grace until we awake in the morning, eager to find out what you have in store for us. Accept our prayer, our praise, our thanks, and appreciation in your Son's name. Amen. Yeah. Well, good night, everybody. Yeah.